December 22, 1944. 2 p.m. The Führer headquarters, deep in the forest near Bad Nauheim, Germany. Adolf Hitler stood over a map table, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the edge. An intelligence report had just arrived from Army Group B. The news was impossible, yet there it was in black and white. George Patton's entire Third Army had disengaged from combat in the Saar region, pivoted 90 degrees north, and was now attacking the southern flank of the Bulge offensive. In less than 72 hours, Patton had moved an entire army over 100 miles through winter weather and hit exactly where the Germans were weakest. The officers in the room waited for Hitler's response. For 6 days, the Ardennes offensive had been succeeding beyond anyone's expectations. 200,000 German soldiers had smashed through American lines. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. Allied forces were in chaos. Hitler's gamble was working. Then Patton arrived. Hitler looked up from the map, his face flushed. According to witnesses, he said something that revealed exactly how much he feared the one American general who moved like a German panzer commander. What Hitler said, and the order he gave in response, would seal the fate of Germany's last major offensive. It would prove that even the Führer knew that Patton was different from every other Allied general. This is the story of how one man's reputation shaped Hitler's decisions during the most desperate gamble of World War II. If you want more deep dives into the commanders and decisions that actually determined how the war was won and lost, subscribe to the channel. We're telling the stories that reveal how personality and ego shaped history. What Hitler did in response to Patton's arrival wasn't just a military decision. It was a moment that showed how much Germany's leadership feared one American general more than entire armies. The German offensive in the Ardennes depended on speed. Hitler's entire plan required capturing Bastogne within 48 hours and reaching the Meuse River within a week. Patton's sudden appearance threw that timetable into complete chaos. The order Hitler gave would divert precious forces away from the main objective and towards stopping Patton. It was a decision born from fear and respect, and it would cost Germany any chance of success. To understand why Hitler reacted the way he did, you need to understand who Patton was to the German High Command. He wasn't just another American general. To the Germans, Patton represented something they thought only they possessed: aggression, the willingness to take risks that made other commanders nervous. From the moment Patton landed in North Africa in 1942, German intelligence had tracked him obsessively. They studied his tactics. They analyzed his movements. They read his writings and speeches. What they discovered worried them. Patton understood mechanized warfare at an instinctive level that most Allied commanders lacked. He didn't just study Clausewitz and Moltke. He believed he had lived past lives as a warrior and that war was his destiny. This wasn't just American bravado. Patton commanded tanks the way Rommel commanded tanks. He understood that armor was about momentum and shock, not careful advances and consolidated positions. German commanders had a grudging respect for several Allied generals. Montgomery was careful and thorough. Bradley was competent and reliable. Eisenhower was an excellent administrator. But Patton was dangerous. He moved too fast. He attacked where he shouldn't. He took risks that violated every rule of conventional warfare. And somehow it worked. During the Sicily campaign in 1943, Patton's 7th Army had raced Montgomery's 8th Army to Messina. Patton won. It infuriated Montgomery but impressed the Germans. They recognized a kindred spirit. When Patton took command of 3rd Army and broke out of Normandy in August 1944, the Germans watched in horror as he executed exactly the kind of sweeping armored offensive they had used to conquer France 4 years earlier. Patton's tanks covered 50 miles in one day. They bypassed strong German positions and attacked headquarters and supply depots. Within 2 weeks, Patton had advanced further than any Allied army in the war. Hitler himself had taken notice. In August 1944, when German forces were retreating across France, Hitler received daily briefings about Patton's movements. His operations staff warned him that Patton was different from Eisenhower and Montgomery, where British and American commanders typically paused to consolidate after an advance. Patton just kept going. His supply lines were dangerously extended. His flanks were exposed. By every conventional measure, he was vulnerable. But he moved so fast that the Germans couldn't organize a counterattack. Hitler made a decision that would haunt him later. He ordered German forces to avoid decisive engagement with Patton and fall back to the Siegfried Line. The Führer wanted to preserve his forces for a future offensive. He didn't want to waste them trying to stop Patton in open terrain where American armor had every advantage. It was sound military logic. It was also an admission that stopping Patton in a mobile battle was nearly impossible. By December 1944, Hitler was facing reality that he refused to accept publicly. Germany was losing the war. Allied armies were on German borders in the west. Soviet forces were crushing German defenses in the east. The Luftwaffe barely existed. German cities were being bombed around the clock. Every rational military assessment said Germany should negotiate a surrender while it still could. Hitler rejected this completely. He believed Germany could still win, or at least force a stalemate. His plan was bold and desperate. Launch a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and destroy 30 Allied divisions. If it succeeded, Britain and America might agree to a negotiated peace. Germany could then concentrate all forces against the Soviets. It was the kind of all-or-nothing gamble that Hitler had made before. Sometimes they worked. This time, it had to work. The German High Command had serious doubts. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt thought the plan was too ambitious. The objectives were too far. The timeline was too tight. German forces were exhausted and under-equipped. But Hitler overruled all objections. He personally planned the offensive down to minute details. He chose the Ardennes because it was weakly defended and because Allied commanders thought the terrain was unsuitable for a major offensive. Hitler scheduled the attack for December 16th, when weather would ground Allied aircraft. He assembled 3 armies in complete secrecy. 200,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces. The Allies suspected nothing. On December 16th, the offensive began exactly as Hitler planned. German forces achieved complete surprise. American units were overwhelmed. Radio communications broke down. Entire regiments surrendered or were destroyed. Within 24 hours, German armored columns had penetrated 20 miles into American lines. Chaos spread through Allied headquarters. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting. The question everyone asked was simple. How had German forces hidden an army of this size? How had Allied intelligence missed it? And most importantly, what could be done to stop it? The answers weren't encouraging. Allied forces were scattered across a 300-mile front. Reserves were limited. Winter weather was preventing air support. Montgomery's forces were far to the north. Bradley's forces were divided by the German penetration. Moving reinforcements would take days or weeks. Meanwhile, German armor was racing west toward the Meuse River. If they crossed the Meuse and reached Antwerp, the entire Allied position in Northern Europe would collapse. For Hitler, those first 6 days were vindication. The offensive was working. American forces were retreating in disorder. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne and refused to surrender, but Hitler wasn't worried. Bastogne would fall eventually. The important thing was that his armies were advancing. Weather was keeping Allied aircraft grounded. For the first time in months, German forces were winning. Then, on December 19th, everything changed. At the Verdun conference, Eisenhower asked his generals how quickly they could counterattack to relieve Bastogne. Patton gave an answer that shocked everyone in the room. 48 hours. 3 divisions. He wasn't guessing. He had been preparing for exactly this scenario. While Supreme Headquarters celebrated advances into Germany, Patton's intelligence officer had been tracking German divisions disappearing from the front lines. Patton suspected something was coming. On December 12, 4 days before the German attack began, he had ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for a rapid pivot north. German intelligence picked up the first signs that something was happening on December 20th. Radio intercepts indicated unusual movement in Patton's sector. Reconnaissance reports showed American units disengaging from combat. At first, German commanders thought Patton was pulling back to reinforce other sectors. Then they realized what was actually happening. Patton wasn't retreating. He was turning his entire army 90 degrees and coming north. The implications were terrifying. If Patton attacked the southern flank of the Bulge, the entire German offensive would be threatened. The roads through Bastogne were essential for German supply lines. If Bastogne held and Patton broke through, German armies advancing toward the Meuse would be cut off. The intelligence reports reached Hitler's headquarters on December 21st. Officers presented the information cautiously. They knew Hitler didn't like bad news. They explained that Patton appeared to be moving north with at least 3 divisions, possibly more. They estimated he would reach the Bastogne area within 2 to 3 days. Hitler's response was immediate and revealing. According to witnesses in the room, including his operations chief Alfred Jodl, Hitler slammed his hand on the map table. The Führer began ranting about Patton specifically. Not about American forces in general. Not about Allied counterattacks. About Patton. Hitler said that Patton was the only American general who understood mobile warfare. He said Patton was the only Allied commander who thought like a German panzer general. He said Patton's arrival changed everything because Patton wouldn't stop at relieving Bastogne. Patton would keep attacking. He would look for weak points and exploit them. He would turn a defensive relief operation into an offensive that threatened the entire German position. What happened next showed exactly how much Hitler feared Patton's arrival. He gave an order that his own generals knew was a mistake. Hitler ordered significant forces diverted from the main offensive to stop Patton's advance. 2 panzer divisions that were supposed to push toward the Meuse were redirected south. Infantry divisions that were supposed to widen the penetration were told to defend against Patton instead. Field Marshal von Rundstedt objected. The entire point of the offensive was to reach the Meuse River and capture Antwerp quickly. Every hour counted. Diverting forces to stop Patton meant abandoning the original plan. Hitler's response was blunt. If Patton broke through, nothing else mattered. The supply lines would be cut. The advancing armies would be isolated. The entire offensive would collapse. Stopping Patton had to be the priority. It was a decision born from fear and respect. Hitler understood that Patton was different. Other Allied commanders would carefully plan their counterattacks. They would wait for reinforcements. They would consolidate positions. Patton would just attack. And once Patton started attacking, he wouldn't stop until something broke. What Hitler didn't fully understand was that Patton was already ahead of him. While German forces were being redirected to stop an anticipated attack, Patton's lead elements were already engaging German positions around Bastogne. On December 22nd, the same day Hitler gave his order to stop Patton, American tanks from Patton's 4th Armored Division were fighting their way north. The weather had briefly cleared, and Allied aircraft were hammering German positions. Patton's artillery was pounding German strong points. The attack Hitler feared was already happening, and it was happening faster than German intelligence predicted. The German forces redirected to stop Patton found themselves fighting a different kind of battle than they expected. American tank commanders were using German tactics against them. They were bypassing strong positions and attacking supply depots. They were moving at night when German forces expected them to consolidate. They were taking risks that seemed reckless but kept German defenders off balance. For German commanders who had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front fighting Soviet armies, this was familiar. It was also deeply frustrating. They were supposed to be on the offensive. They were supposed to be racing west. Instead, they were fighting defensively against an enemy who moved like they moved. Hitler received updates throughout December 23rd and 24th. The news got worse each day. Patton's forces were making steady progress. The weather was improving, which meant Allied air power was returning. German casualties were mounting. The advance toward the Meuse had stalled. Units that should have been 50 miles west were still fighting around Bastogne. On December 26th, the breakthrough happened. American tanks from Patton's army linked up with the 101st Airborne. Bastogne was relieved. The road junction was secure. German supply lines were threatened. Hitler's reaction was predictable but telling. He blamed his generals for not stopping Patton. He demanded that German forces recapture Bastogne immediately. He ordered additional reserves sent south to stop Patton's continued advance. Every order pulled forces away from the original objective. The offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies was now focused on stopping one American general who had done exactly what Hitler feared he would do. Hitler's staff tried to salvage the situation. They proposed abandoning the thrust toward Antwerp and consolidating gains already made. Hitler refused. He ordered attacks to continue. German forces complied, but without conviction. They knew the offensive had failed. Patton's arrival had changed the battle's momentum. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. German forces had exhausted themselves in the initial offensive. Patton's counterattack had disrupted their supply lines and forced them into defensive fighting. By mid-January, German armies were retreating. They left behind destroyed equipment, thousands of prisoners, and any hope of forcing a negotiated peace with the Western Allies. Hitler's gamble had failed. The last German reserves were gone. The road to Berlin was open. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated German commanders about their decisions during the Bulge. They asked specifically about the decision to divert forces to stop Patton. Several German officers admitted that Hitler's fear of Patton had influenced the decision. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's operations chief, told interrogators that the Führer believed Patton was the most dangerous Allied commander. When intelligence reported that Patton was coming north, Hitler immediately understood what it meant. It meant the offensive was in serious danger. Jodl said Hitler's respect for Patton was genuine. The Führer studied reports of Patton's campaigns. He admired Patton's aggressive style. He also feared it because he knew Patton couldn't be predicted or contained the way other Allied generals could. Field Marshal von Rundstedt told British interrogators something even more revealing. He said the German High Command had always assumed that Eisenhower would keep Patton on a tight leash. They believed American caution and British influence would prevent Patton from being given free rein. The Ardennes offensive proved them wrong. When the crisis came, Eisenhower turned to Patton and told him to do what he did best. Von Rundstedt said that was the moment the German offensive was truly doomed. Not because American forces were stronger. Not because German logistics failed. But because Eisenhower finally unleashed the one general who fought the way Germans fought. The irony wasn't lost on German commanders. They had spent years developing tactics of mobile warfare. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, speed and shock, bypassing strong points, deep penetration, exploitation of success. Every major German victory from Poland to France to Russia had used these tactics. Then an American general came along who understood those tactics instinctively and used them better than the Germans themselves. Patton's relief of Bastogne wasn't just a tactical success. It was a strategic humiliation. The German army, which prided itself on mobility and aggressive action, had been outmaneuvered by an enemy they considered inferior. For Hitler personally, Patton represented something painful. Proof that Germany no longer had a monopoly on military excellence. The Wehrmacht in 1944 was not the Wehrmacht of 1940. The best officers were dead. Equipment was inferior. Training was rushed. Fuel was scarce. Replacements were teenagers and old men. Meanwhile, American forces had everything Germany lacked. Equipment, fuel, air power, fresh troops. And in Patton, they had a commander who understood how to use those advantages. Hitler's decision to divert forces to stop Patton was rational from a military standpoint. Patton posed a genuine threat to the offensive. But it was also an emotional decision. Hitler couldn't accept that an American general could outthink and outmaneuver German commanders. Stopping Patton became about more than military necessity. It became about pride. That pride cost Germany the last chance to avoid complete defeat. The forces diverted to stop Patton might not have been enough to reach Antwerp anyway. German logistics were already failing. Allied air power was returning. The weather was improving. But those forces might have stabilized the German position and allowed a more organized withdrawal. Instead, they were thrown into desperate fighting against Patton's army and were destroyed. By February 1945, the German army that Hitler had assembled for the Ardennes offensive no longer existed. Entire divisions were gone. Equipment was lost. Experienced officers were dead or captured. The road to the Rhine was open. Within 3 months, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine and driving into the heart of Germany. Patton continued his advance east. His Third Army crossed the Rhine, drove through southern Germany, and ended the war in Czechoslovakia. Along the way, German forces consistently retreated or surrendered when they learned Patton was coming. The reputation Hitler feared had become a weapon more powerful than tanks or artillery. German commanders knew that fighting Patton meant accepting a fast, brutal, and ultimately losing battle. Many chose not to fight at all. So when Hitler stood over that map table on December 22, 1944, and learned that Patton was coming, his reaction revealed everything about Germany's situation. The Führer wasn't just worried about losing the offensive. He was facing the reality that Germany had lost the advantage it once held. The psychological edge. The belief that German forces were superior in training, tactics, and leadership. Patton shattered that belief. He proved that the Allies could produce commanders just as aggressive, just as skilled, and just as willing to take risks as any German general. And unlike German generals in 1944, Patton had the resources to back up his aggression. The order Hitler gave to stop Patton sealed Germany's fate in the Ardennes. It turned an offensive operation into a defensive one. It wasted Germany's last reserves on a battle they couldn't win. And it proved that even Hitler knew the truth. When the crisis came, when everything was on the line, the Germans feared Patton more than any other Allied commander. That fear, as much as any military factor, determined the outcome of Hitler's last gamble in the West. After the war, German officers were asked repeatedly which Allied commander they respected most. The answers varied depending on who was asking. British officers usually heard praise for Montgomery. American officers heard praise for Bradley or Eisenhower. But when German commanders spoke candidly to each other, or to historians years later, one name came up more than any other: Patton. Not because he was flawless. He made mistakes. He was difficult. He created diplomatic problems. But because he understood war the way they understood war. Aggressive. Relentless. And in December 1944, when Hitler learned that Patton was coming, the Führer understood what that meant. It meant the offensive was over. It meant Germany had lost its last chance. It meant the war would end exactly as Hitler had always feared, with German armies crushed and Berlin in ruins. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most revealing moments. If you want more stories about the decisions and personalities that actually shaped the war, check out our other videos. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. These stories about leadership, ego, and strategic decisions deserve to be told.